Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I was given some weaving from a friend in exchange for something I knitted for her. I have my first day with the sheep in a year with the sheep, and I have an update on my hand-spun, hand-dyed, self-designed cardigan project. So let's get started. A few episodes ago, I showed you some knitted knockers that I had made for a friend of mine. I've known her for 25 years. She was asking me if I could make some, and she, was offering to pay me. She wanted to commission me. And I said, who are they for? And she's like, well, one would be for me and one would be for my sister. I'm like, what? She had just been diagnosed and hadn't had her surgery yet, but she remembered that I had made one for a sister-in-law of hers probably 10, 15 years ago. What they are is they are a knitted prosthetic breast. They're very soft, very comfortable, and there's an organization that will even make them and give them to people who need them for free. But of course, if you know somebody personally who needs one, you're going to want to knit one for them. So my friend wanted to commission me to knit these for her, and I'm like, absolutely not. The only payment is another 25 years of friendship. Now, she's a writer. That's how we met. We were in a fiction writing group together. We were critique partners. She ended up publishing a couple of novels. And then she's also a weaver. And so we're both members of the Weavers Guild, and during the state fair, we will volunteer together at the Weavers Guild booth, and she'll demonstrate weaving and I'll demonstrate spinning. So we get together, several times a year, especially to doing things that have to do with the Weavers Guild. So anyway, we arranged to have lunch last week, and then I wanted to give her these knitted knockers, and then she hands me a gift bag, and it was some hand woven towels. So this is one, and this is the other. I will go to the overhead and show these to you up close. As soon as I'm done filming today, this one is going to go into our guest bathroom because it's going to match in there really well. And then this one, I think we're going to probably use it in the kitchen as a kitchen towel. I will say that for the first time in my life, I understood why people sometimes say, oh, I can't use this. This is too good to use, because that was my reaction. She's like, no, you have to use them. So I'm going to, because I know what that, I sometimes make dishcloths as a housewarming, and people are like, oh, I can't use these. I'm like, no, use them, and when they get ratty, tell me and I'll give you some more. But these are just beautiful, and they're so wonderful. And this is the kind of friend who understands the value of making something by hand, that it isn't just, it's a monetary value, but it's something that you have made that's part of you, and you're doing it for this other person, and it means so much to both of you. So it's really wonderful. I absolutely did not expect her to give me anything in exchange for the knitted knockers, but they're beautiful. So let's go to the overhead, and then I'll show you up close what they look like. So these are the two towels. They're a good size. They look like they're about 24 inches long and maybe 18 inches wide. They might even be longer than 24 inches. They might be 30 inches long. I don't know. But there's two different colors of green. So let me show you these close up. This one I remember her telling me about a couple of months ago when she was working on this particular weave. She said it's called cat paws and snail trails. So these are meant to be the little cat paws, and these are the little snail trails. But it's just lovely. So it's a dark green, a lighter green, and then this pink is for the weft. So it's really cool. I love looking close up at weaving and seeing how the strands are weaving in and out with each other, and how those create different patterns. This is what the back side of that pattern looks like. There's just so much that's interesting about, comparing different textile arts to understand the differences, but also the connections. So this is the first one. This is the one that's going to go in our guest bathroom because the color is going to work really well in there. And this one is just beautiful as well. So I imagine this is a simpler weave because it doesn't have those swirls and things. It's more vertical and horizontal. And this one has, I don't know if it's the same greens, the same light green and the same dark green, and then sideways, oh no, then there's another blue. There's so many. It's when you start looking at it up close and you start seeing all of the other colors in there. I don't know what this type of weave is called. I don't know. It's just beautiful and I admire it so much. I did take a weaving class maybe 35 years ago. I'd just been here in the Twin Cities for a year or two when I took a class. I bought it was a little rigid heddle loom. It was part of the class and we warped it. It was like over 3 sessions. We chose our yarn, we warped it, and then we worked on weaving it, and I finished it and I was actually very happy with the result, and I thought, well, this is not for me. And then when I joined the Weavers Guild a few years ago when I learned to spin, they were having a free class just to like sort of tour the Weavers Guild so you could see what all they had. And we went through there and then I saw these rooms where they have these giant looms that are not looms that you necessarily would have in your own home, but they're looms that they teach on. So the students will spend the first class warping it together, and then they each sign up for a time when they're going to come in and warp and weave their section of it, and then at the end you cut them apart and then take your part home. And I thought, well, that could be interesting. That would be a type of weaving class I might take at some point in the future, possibly. I don't have room for a loom. I wasn't sure I was going to have room for my sewing in this room when I brought it in here a couple of years ago. And now that I am getting back into sewing, I'm already trying to think about how can I rearrange things better to accommodate my YouTube studio, my knitting, and the sewing. Not to mention the spinning that I do in here. And the whole point of having this room is that it's the biggest, secondary bedroom in the house. And it can house everything, because before I was using spaces that weren't big enough and I was spread all over the place. And out of sight, out of mind, so I would just abandon something and forget it was there, not see it until I came in a month later, and then it would be a total mess. And I just don't want to extend outside of this room. There's just no room for a loom. And I'm just so interested in sewing right now and having my fabric pre-made for me. So I'm saying this now, I'm not planning on taking any weaving classes myself. I just appreciate having a friend who can weave and did weave and presented me with some of her weaving. So the Minnesota Weavers Guild has various special interest groups. One of them is called Whirling Spinsters. So it's once a month the spinners get together and spin, and it's year-round. During the winter months, well, probably at least 8 months of the year, which is about what the winter is here, they're at the Weavers Guild indoors, and that's in the downtown area. And then in the summer, they meet at a park. It's called Waben Picnic Area. It's a park near, if you're in the Twin Cities, it's near the Minnehaha Falls, that kind of area. And it's really nice to be outside in the beautiful weather, spinning and enjoying the late daylight hours. So at some point last summer, one of the other spinners was talking about this year with the sheep that she had signed up for at Get Bent's farm. It sounded really interesting, and that was the farm. She has a mill too, and that's where I'd gotten the roving that I ended up spinning into yarn that I am making into a sweater. You spend a year with the sheep, so every couple of months you go to the farm, you help with different things, so you get to see how the lambs grow up, you get to be there for the shearing, you learn how to do the skirting. You're just learning about the whole sort of life cycle, annual life cycle of the sheep farm. And I thought that sounded fascinating. So as soon as January hit, I put on my calendar to start looking for that. So when she would send out her newsletters, I would look for that because I thought it sounded so exciting. And she only lets like 7 or 8 people do it. So as soon as I saw it, my friend Elizabeth and I were texting each other, "Are you going to sign up? Are you going to sign up?" And so our first day was this past Sunday. So we drove down there. We had no idea really what we were going to do. We were told we were going to be helping with ear tagging of the lambs. So it's lambing season and most of the lambs had been born. There were just 4 that she was still waiting on, but most of them had been born. And so she gave us kind of a tour of the farm in the buildings and the mill, like where she has her mill housed. She has a friend who uses some of this land that you can plant things on, but it's very windy and it gets sunburned, so it's not really good grazing land for the sheep. So her friend has a natural dye garden and had gotten a grant for the first natural dye garden that wasn't specifically indigo. It was everything but indigo. So she started this garden, and she harvests the plants and she dries them in this barn. Half the barn is for the gardening, the dye garden stuff, and then the other half is for the mini mill. And so we got to see, she doesn't process or she doesn't scour raw wool. If you want to have your wool processed at her farm, which I don't think she does anymore because she has so much of her own, but she only takes scoured wool. She's got a picker, which kind of breaks up the locks, and then she's got a drum carder, and it's got multiple drums in it, so it mostly only has to go through one pass. And then she has a machine that creates the singles, and then when all the singles are created, she can then use it also to ply the yarn. So it's really small. She really can't get any bigger than that. But it's really interesting to see. Every mill that I've gone to or have seen videos of, every one of them is a little different. And some of it is the scale of the operation, and some of it is just they're doing different things. So it was really interesting to see. Now, part of this year with the sheep is that they shear twice a year. So they're going to have a shearing in the fall, and that's when we get to pick which lamb's fleece that we want. And then we'll have to take care of scouring it ourselves, but we could do all of the processing ourselves, combs or cards or whatever, or we can have it processed on the machines there. And I'm hoping then we get to, if like I choose to do this, that I would be able to come for a day and be there while it's all being processed and learn a little bit more about how all of that works. That sounds really interesting to me because, I have a crank drum carder. I could process it myself, but I'm really interested in understanding how the mechanical aspects of that work. So we got to see all of that. And then they were, herding the sheep into, an area that they could pen off. They don't use sheepdogs there because they mostly have heritage breeds, either full breed or a crossbreed. And she said that the difference between like the domesticated sheep and then the heritage breeds is that the heritage breeds will scatter when there is a predator in the area, which means they don't do well with herding. And then the other kind, they cluster together. The flock's survival is they all flock together, and so those can be herded. So they were just sort of manually trapping one ewe and her lamb at a time and getting them penned up, and then they would pass a lamb over the fence to each of us. Now, I got a pretty big lamb that was kind of feisty. She said, "Who wants the first one? This one's feisty." And I was thinking, I just can't wait to get my hands on a sheep. And nobody else said that. I'm like, I'll take him. So he was big. and he was kicking his legs. And but what they told us was to sit them on their butt with their hind legs sticking straight out, sort of the position that they are in when they're being sheared. And she said the reason they shear them in that position is because when they're in that position, they just sit there calmly. They're completely relaxed. So I sat him down and said, you know, they were catching them and handing them over. And then they came around with the kit, you know, so that we could write down the tag name, write down whether it was a ewe or a ram, what the mother was, and then what the color it was. And so we wrote all that down, and then they put the tag in the ear so that her husband, he does the actual tagging. She holds the sheep while it's being tagged, and he was doing the tagging. And he feels for a vein that kind of comes down to make sure that they're not going to pierce through that. He said that it just bleeds a lot, and you don't want to see a lot of blood. So they get it in that exactly the right spot. And then we just held on to them until that set was done, and then we passed them back over the fence. And it was interesting. The lambs were pretty quiet most of the time. Once in a while they would, the one that I had was bleating fairly often. But a lot of times the lambs are just completely quiet until their mamas would come up on the other side of the fence and would say something, and then the baby would call back because they have their unique call and response between the two of them. So it was so interesting. And then in the second batch of them, she brought out these she had 3 of them that she was just holding all at one time. They were tiny little sheep. They were maybe less than a week old, but they were tiny lambs because she's experimenting with some crossbreeding with a Suey, I think is how it's pronounced, ewe, and then a baby doll Southdown ram, because she wanted to create what she's calling TFL, tiny farm lambs. They were so tiny because then they would be good for grazing in vineyards and orchards. That's her goal, is to create this little breed that would be good for that. And the suey apparently are used in the French vineyards for that purpose, so that they can graze all of the grass around there on the ground without doing any damage to the fruit that's on the trees. I think this is something that they do for the solar farms too, where they have these like fields full of solar panels, and then they have these smaller sheep that will graze down around there and don't harm the solar panels. I think that's something that I've seen in the past year as well. So after we got the tagging done, then everybody had brought something to share for lunch, and she had made this Icelandic lamb stew, which is a little disconcerting, that you can oftentimes know the name of the sheep that produced the fleece that you turned into yarn, and then there's another one that got turned into a stew. Luckily, we don't know the names of those. It was just a beautiful day. It was 60 degrees and so sunny, and we're outside, in our sweaters and stuff. It was just beautiful. And then she took us on a walk through all of their land. She hasn't put the sheep out into the pasture land yet. She's waiting for the grass to get a little bit more. They have like 40 acres, and maybe 11 of it is actually could be used for cropland. The rest of it is subprime agricultural land. So it's like woods and ponds and things like that. So the sheep can still graze in there and forage around in there, but it wouldn't be good as cropland. And they are really practicing regenerative farming and taking out the invasive plants and trees and trying to make room for the native types of trees and plants. She said that back in like I think maybe 20s, 30s, and 40s, it had been a cattle farm, and then that's where the cattle would just graze all through the woods, and it was all oak trees and native plants and stuff. And then the U.S. government convinced farmers that their cattle were destroying the forest lands, which they don't, and that they would be better off in feedlots. And so that's what the farmers did. And then this land that had native trees and plants and stuff. All the oak trees got overtaken by other kinds of trees. There's a lot of buckthorn, which is an invasive thing. So they're turning everything back to the way it was, and it's really interesting. It was really nice to see. It's really early spring here, so the only things that were kind of green were the invasive plants. The native plants weren't yet budding out yet. So it'll be interesting to see what it's like in a couple months when we come back, and then see how everything has changed with the seasons. But that was my first day with the sheep, and I'm looking forward to many, many more in the coming year. And I will share that with you along the way. So finally, the day has come when I got started on my hand-spun, hand-dyed, self-designed cardigan that I am using with the WAM, the wool alpaca mohair from Get Bent's farm. So I typically have a basic silhouette that I work with in terms of measurements. I like a set-in sleeve. I like, shoulder shaping. And I know how wide I want the back of my neck to be typically. Sometimes I want a waist shaping. I kind of know how much I want there. I know how long I want the sweater. So having that basic silhouette is not really an issue. But typically, I like to knit the body at least bottom up, and if I can, knit it flat, just because I like smaller pieces. It feels like I'm progressing faster, just psychologically. And also, I'm only concentrating on one piece. And if you're working the back of a sweater and you have complex stitch patterns, which I frequently do, I like to work with cables a lot. And so often there's multiple stitch patterns and panels that I have to kind of get a handle on. There's no shaping that I have to worry about. I can just think about establishing the stitch patterns. Now, sometimes I will knit the body in the round, and if I do that, then it helps to establish it, because what I do in the first half, I'm going to do in the second half of the round. So sometimes I will work the body in one piece. Still not my favorite, but there's some times when there are reasons why I might not want to do a seam on the side just aesthetically. I don't mind seaming. It's not knitting, but I'm good at it. And even if I put it off, sometimes once I get going on it, it's kind of meditative and relaxing. So you just have to know how to do it, and then it's not a big deal. Sleeves, I frequently do knit those top down, just because I don't always know, for a couple of reasons. Again, if I have a complex stitch pattern going on, there might be a very specific thing that I want at the top of the sleeve cap, so that I want to establish that there, and then I have more room to kind of fudge where I'm ending it down at the bottom of the sleeve. But because that's just more visible, sometimes that's more important for me that I have that ending or starting at a place that makes sense to balance out the whole pattern. So that's often how I'm knitting my sweaters. The top down is just, because I don't do it a lot, it just requires a lot more mental gymnastics for me to orient where I am. But also, if I'm using a stitch pattern, I have to be learning and establishing the stitch pattern at the same time I'm doing all of the most complex shaping of the sweater. So I prefer, the bottom up, where I've established the stitch patterns, and then when I get to the underarms, first of all, I can really confirm my row gauge measurement. I'll wash and block at that point, make sure that I know what my row gauge is, it's the length I expect, and that all of the shaping that I'm going to be doing in the upper bodice is going to work out based on my initial calculations, assuming a specific row gauge. And if it's not that, then I can adjust things. So I like working that way. I'm just used to working that way. I'm sure if I work top down more often, I'd get used to that. Row gauge is so important in shaping. If you really don't have that nailed down, you could end up having to rip back more often. But also, like, trying to establish stitch patterns while you're doing all of this shaping, and you're doing all of the shaping on all of the parts at one time. when I'm knitting in one piece, if I make an error that forces me to rip back, I'm only ripping back, you know, at the most, you know, the stitches that are in the back. If I make some kind of profound mistake when I've got all of the stitches for all of the parts on the needles, I have to rip back hundreds and hundreds of stitches for multiple rows, and that I don't like. So that's just my preference. It's not better than somebody else's preference. It's just aligns with the things that I like to do and the reasons that I like to do things that way. So top down is always more of a challenge for me. And it's usually done for a specific reason, like, oh, this is going to help with the stitch pattern if I do it in this direction. And it's just so slow going. And my spreadsheets that I create when I'm designing something myself are way more intense than they are if I have a published pattern, because basically my pattern is the spreadsheet. I don't have like written instructions that I'm following if I'm designing it myself. I have a schematic, I have my gauge, and I'm calculating stitch counts and where I'm going to be doing all of these things. I'm laying out stitch patterns on a chart using Stitch Mastery so I can just visualize what the whole thing is actually going to look like. And then I do my spreadsheet with all of the numbers and making sure that I know where I'm doing this shaping and that shaping and the other shaping, so I can keep track of where I am row by row. It's just a lot more intense for me to do something top-down seamless, especially with the simultaneous set and sleeve construction. All right, so I've started my sweater finally. This is the handspun yarn that I made from Wham, which is a wool alpaca mohair blend from Get Bent's farm, the woman who's doing Year with the Sheep. And then I dyed 5 shades of this teal color to make stripes. So the construction of this is a top-down, seamless, simultaneous set-in sleeve construction. So it's top down, but it's not raglan and it's not circular yoke. I like having shoulders coming across here. I like the way set-in sleeves fit. That's just my preferred tight style of sweater. I really prefer knitting them bottom up, but in this case, I felt like top down was the right approach for this particular sweater because I wanted the sleeves to be striped, you know, exactly this way. I wanted, you know, everything to start at a specific place, and then I have some leeway for length if I need to. So the way this type of sweater starts is that you cast on. So you're working in this direction. So you cast on all the stitches you need from one shoulder to the other. You purl back. And then some people will have you work the shoulder shaping on this shoulder and then go across, do the shoulder shaping on that shoulder, and then purl back. Yeah, it would be purl back to here. And then you would do the front, and then you would knit for like an inch until you have an inch of depth at the shoulder, because when you're doing short rows, you're doing all of the length towards the neck, and you don't really have any at the shoulders. So they want you to do an extra inch or two. It really depends on the approach that you are using. And so then once you have that inch down there, then you come and you pick up stitches for the left shoulder over here. You do your shoulder shaping, and then you again knit your extra inch, and then you come over here, pick up stitches, and do it. Now, some people will have you, when you're done with the back and your 1 inch, you'd cut the yarn and then rejoin and pick up stitches over here, cut the yarn and rejoin, pick up stitches. That's what I do. There is another method, I think her name is Aza or Aza, Tricosa, she is the designer name. And her ziggurat method is to avoid cutting the yarn, and instead you pick up stitches from the wrong, you're doing things where sometimes you have to pick up stitches from the wrong side and sometimes from the right side, and I just don't want to do that. So I don't like picking up stitches from the wrong side. And if, some people don't mind it, or they prefer it, or if they want to rip out, they don't want to have any cut ends. And so everybody gets to do it their way. So my preference is to cut the yarn and do the shoulder separately. So once you have 1 inch down on each side, that will give you, an inch this way and an inch that way. And so then you start knitting everything at the same time. So you would, I guess maybe you do this shoulder. Oh, I see everything's upside down. I think this is the first shoulder you do, and then this is the second shoulder you do. And once you're done with this one, you knit across. You pick up stitches at the top of the cap. You knit across. Again, you pick up stitches up here, and then you knit across again. And now you're going to be knitting back and forth. And you're going to be knitting back and forth until you're done with your neck shaping. And so, which means you have a shaping rate along here, and then you have shaping rate for your sleeves. You're not doing any shaping on the body side because the armholes are straight down. It's a set-in sleeve construction. There's different shaping rates. You're doing all of the parts at one time. There's different shaping rates at different places. And then you need to establish any stitch patterns. So a lot of times the top-down constructions are pretty basic stitch patterns. A lot of stockinette or close to mostly stockinette, just depending. And this one certainly is, but I have stripes. And this is a horizontal pattern. And I have this plan for this gradient that I need to play out over the course of the body. And that relies on really knowing what my row gauge is. Actually, knowing your row gauge is really important for all of this upper body part. So that's one of the challenges, is you do your swatch and you get your row gauge, and all of the shaping is dependent on that row gauge, so that when you get to the underarm, you have the depth that you need. It's not too long, it's not too short. Because if your row gauge is off, then that's going to be off, how deep that is. Tricky to confirm my row gauge at the very beginning, because you have a few stitches this way and then some this way and then some that way. Things are turning in different directions, and so it was hard to get a reliable row gauge, and I was pretty sure that I was getting 6.5 rows per inch and not the 7 that I'd gotten in my swatch. So I had to do some recalculations of the shaping for the sleeve. And also I had to think about the fact that the stripes were going to play out differently than I had originally planned. So I had to adjust that a little bit, and then do all my calculations and make sure everything was going to work out correctly. So I want to talk a little bit about the resources that I use for top-down set-in sleeve construction. So Knitting from the Top by Barbara G. Walker. She did all of the treasuries of stitch patterns. She wrote a number of books in the 70s. And she really established other types of top-down seamless sweater construction besides the raglan, which had been around since at least the 1930s. I have a book that has a top-down seamless raglan knit on circular needles, how to design one yourself, from the 30s, and those were popular all through the mid-century. So she tells you how you can do all kinds of other things top-down, not just sweaters. But she came up with 2 methods of doing set-in sleeves top-down. One of them is the method I'm using for this sweater, where they're done simultaneously with the body, the way you would work your sleeves simultaneously with the body if you were doing a raglan or circular yoke. And then the other method is one where you work the front and the back flat until you get to the underarms, and then you join in the round and work down, and you come back to the armholes later and pick up stitches all the way around and do short row shaping for the sleeve cap, and then knit your way down. So those are our two methods. And because she came up with these 50 years ago, people have revised them either for fashion reasons or technique reasons or whatever. They're just refining it. So one person who came up with a refinement of this is a woman named, I think her name is pronounced Tulia. I'll put her name on the screen. She came up with something called the tailored sweater. And it is a whole process that's based on Barbara Walker's. It has some refinements, but it also, she goes through how do you measure yourself, what do you measure, and then, you know, you need to figure out how much ease you want, so it depends on the kind of sweater. But you can plug all those numbers in. There's a spreadsheet, and you can plug the numbers in with your gauge, and it will help you, you know, step by step with those numbers. So then this other method that is Asa Tricosa, the ziggurat method, is based on Tulia's tailored sweater method, and it's just avoiding having to cut any yarns and being able to do everything without ever cutting your yarn, except when you get to the underarms. So, you know, there's different refinements, and my refinement was that Walker's and Tulia's approach for doing the sleeve cap is just a different, it's kind of a roomier sleeve than I would like. When I learned to knit in the 80s, the sweaters were oversized and the sleeves were always sort of, you know, enormous. They had just as much ease in terms of actual inches as the body. So if you had 4 inches of ease in the body, there would be 4 inches of ease in the sleeve. And if your arm is only 11 or 12 inches big, I mean, that's a lot of ease. So the sleeves were a lot roomier, but you can see on this one, this is more closely fitting. It's not tight. There is room in here, but it's just more closely fitting. It's not, and this is what I prefer these days. So I adjust the shaping rate and therefore the number of stitches that I'm going to have on the needles when it's time to separate from the underarm, so that I don't have this enormous number that I might have otherwise. And this is all just based on making observations, looking at how other patterns are done, using something as a template the first time I want to design my own thing, and then you know, just borrowing from other places and figuring out, well, how do I like this to fit, and therefore how am I going to design the sweater that's going to be for me. It's fun for me to think about how to do this, and also, you know, dyeing this gradient and figuring out how it's going to lay out the stripes, and doing all of that has been really fun. And even creating the spreadsheets, that's all fun for me. So it isn't fun for everyone else necessarily. This is a fun project. So hopefully I will be done with it in less than a year from when I started spinning. That's my goal. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.